Dr. Rupy, what a pleasure it is to have you on the Be That Life podcast. And the fact that I'm in London,
Yeah.
one of my favorite cities in the world, and I get to record this with you, I feel so lucky.
Oh, that's so sweet. And you've literally arrived on like the most perfect day in London in
Uh,
March, which is unbelievable,
right?
right?
Yeah, you know what? I've been lucky. I've been here for almost a month now,
Uh-huh.
and I have had incredible weather the whole time I've been here, and it just keeps getting better and
Amazing.
better.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I live in Dubai, and I
Uh-huh.
actually grew up there. And for me, I would love to live in a city that at least have all the four seasons. It's
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, yeah, it's
So, did you
great.
grow up in London?
I grew up in London. I was in East London, which is where I was born, and then I went to med school in West London, Imperial, and then I've worked all over South London, Brighton. I worked in A&E and ITU in Australia, and I've worked for over 15 years in London. I love it.
And you were with the NHS.
Yes, NHS, general practice, as well as a bit of A&E and ITU.
How long were you with the NHS? Can we talk a little bit about your journey?
Over 15 years. So I started out doing obviously med school. I was at med school for 6 years. And then my journey actually started back in 2009 when I first qualified. And that's when I was diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, which
Wow,
is
okay.
a heart condition where your heart beats irregularly. And in my case, very, very fast. And that was my journey as a patient, really. I saw a whole bunch of different cardiologists. We couldn't figure out a particular trigger. I was going to have something called an ablation, which is where you put a guide wire into the heart or around the pulmonary vein. You burn an area of cells there to stop these misfiring signals. And it was my mum, who's not a medical doctor or anyone sort of nutritionally focused. She's just, typical Indian mum, who said, I should really think about diet and lifestyle before I entertain quite a significant intervention. And that was the start of my journey. I started cleaning up my diet. I started meditating. I started looking into yoga. I started reading research papers. And after about a year and a half of doing all these different things, I was actually able to reverse my own heart condition, which is pretty incredible. And it led me to try and answer two questions, which is A, how on earth is this possible? And B, why wasn't I taught any of this kind of stuff at medical school around lifestyle medicine and preventative medicine? And so throughout my career, I've always felt like I've lived this double life of one, being a conventional doctor and doing the best I can within the NHS system, and two, like learning simultaneously and figuring out how do we better manage type 2 diabetes? How can we improve people's gut health? Why do not people don't know about the microbiota
Right.
in a lot more detail?
Totally.
And so this has kind of led me to this point where I started the Doctor's Kitchen, and I share recipes and nutritional medicine info, and I just completed my master's in nutrition as well. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of other things that have evolved from that starting point as a patient.
So, when you developed that issue, what was the trigger?
It's very hard to determine exactly what that trigger is, but I think it was a cacophony of different things. So, junior doctor lifestyle is not really conducive to a healthy way of life. Night shifts, poor sleep, poor eating habits, refined carbohydrates, eating on the go, stress. And I think my propensity to having a condition was clearly something in my genetic line. But, other than the symptoms that I was suffering with 2 to 3 times a week, sometimes 24 plus hours, I was otherwise a normal, healthy individual. I wasn't overweight. I didn't have any preceding issues. I had nothing in my family history. I wasn't a smoker or a drinker. I didn't drink caffeine back then. So there were no specific triggers, but simply, and you'll know a lot about this, putting my body in the best environment allowed it to thrive. And just
Yeah.
putting myself in the best environment looked like improving my diet, adding more fiber, thinking about phytonutrients, these plant chemicals in fruits and vegetables that are colorful, reducing stress in making sure that I was going to bed on time, doing different sorts of exercise, so a bit of flow, yoga, relaxation, stretching, rather than just endurance or resistance training. And just putting my body in the best environment, our bodies are very smart. It knows what to do. So whether this could be put down to improving my microbiota, reducing inflammation, reducing cortisol, improving my hormones, it's very hard to retrospectively pinpoint exactly the one thing. And the reason why is because it's unlikely to be just one thing.
Yes,
It's going to be a
unlikely.
collection of all these different inputs. And this is why I'm a big fan of thinking through things holistically, with individuals, with patients, and with ourselves.
I think it starts with a story, our own journey, our own story as to why we end up where we're at today.
Yeah.
And now you have come out with your
Fifth
fifth
book.
book.
Yeah.
Fifth book.
Yeah. It's
And
incredible.
when did you decide that you wanted to be a cookbook author?
I never decided I wanted to be a cookbook. I kind of just fell
Yeah.
into it. So when I was
Because you
working,
loved cooking recipes.
I always loved cooking.
Yeah, you loved cooking.
I've always
Loved
loved
making,
cooking.
yeah.
Yeah, because when I was at med school, even, I got this reputation for the guy that knew how to cook because my mom taught me a couple of recipes before I went.
Nice.
And to keep up this reputation, I started learning more recipes, and I genuinely loved it.
Yeah.
Like at home, we were very experimental. We obviously had loads of Indian cuisine, but my mum would experiment with Italian. We would have Chinese. We'd have all this stuff, and we'd always be watching food shows as well. So I was always constantly absorbing information from shows. And when I got ill, I kind of applied my knowledge of food and combinations to healthy eating. And that's what made healthy eating a lot more, it was just easy for me because, I wasn't just having plain brown rice with greens and a bit of chicken breast on the side, for example. I was having flavors, spices. I was like layering different greens into each other. I was, adding texture with nuts and seeds. I was using pastes and spices that I'd make myself. So I was always an experimental cook. And when I started sharing recipes online was when I got picked up by publishers. And when I came back to the UK, I got a book deal to do a cookbook.
That's
It was,
incredible.
I mean, back then it wasn't a thing for doctors to do cookbooks. That
Yeah.
was one of the first ones. And I love it, honestly, because I want to make things as practical as possible. So whilst we have a podcast and we teach people the evidence base around nutritional medicine, and some of the Instagram stuff that we do is educational in nature, I want people to be able to put this into practice. And the best way to put it into practice is with healthy, delicious food that is functional as well as flavorful. And that's why I love doing cookbooks.
You do realize you're like every woman's dream, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Hopefully my wife's listening
oh
to this.
my God, you're so lucky, honest. Like, yeah, every woman would love to have a man that just knows how to cook incredible meals.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I wish my partner would listen to this and start, kind of looking at your recipes maybe
Yeah.
and start cooking me some meals. It would
Well,
be
they're very
amazing.
easy.
Yeah, I did see some, and I
Yeah.
saw like a lot of like really healthy breads that you can make at home,
Yes,
and really
yeah.
simple ingredients and simple methods.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like
Yeah.
that your approach is simple,
Yeah.
that anyone can do it, because it's overwhelming for a lot of people that don't really like cooking.
Yeah.
When they look at cookbooks and there's like all of these different ingredients,
For sure.
and such a complicated method that
Yeah.
you feel you don't want to do it. You develop anxiety and you're like, forget about it.
Yeah.
I can't even be bothered doing it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I like that your approach is really simple and easy. And
Uh-huh.
for sure, when I get back to Dubai, the first thing I'm gonna do is order your cookbook, and I'm gonna start making all of those incredible meals.
Nice.
So this particular cookbook that you came out with now is a book high on protein.
Yeah.
Important topic these days.
Yeah, very.
A lot of medical doctors, researchers are also debunking a lot of the myths and misconceptions on protein.
Mm-hmm.
And it couldn't have been a better time than now.
For sure.
Also, you didn't specialize nutritional medicine at school,
Med school.
at med
Yeah,
school.
yeah.
And I know for a fact that in general, doctors don't really have a lot of training on nutrition in general at school. And having your own story and your own issue and whatever happened to you made you kind of like become more of an advocate for eating better.
For sure.
Right? And so my first question to you is, you know so much about protein. You understand it from a perspective of women's health, men's health. What are the current misconceptions currently that people should be aware of?
Yeah. So the reason why I wrote Healthy High Protein, the book, and every bit of information right now that we are doing is around debunking a lot of myths around protein is because I massively changed my opinion on protein. So I used to be of the opinion that we were getting enough protein, and generally we need to concern ourselves with fiber, phytonutrients, diversity. Whilst that's still very, very important, protein is something that is equally important, particularly for those who transition to a more plant predominant diet. And this actually happened to me. And it was a big realization during my nutritional medicine masters where I realized I was under consuming protein myself. So let's take a step back. What do we mean by protein? What is protein? I think a lot of people don't actually understand what protein is. Protein is the most important macronutrient for your body. If you think about, and I use this analogy in the book, Lego, building blocks of toys, the beauty of Lego was as long as you had enough pieces, even if you only had around 20, you could build very simple structures like a toy car. Or if you had enough pieces, you could build an entire cathedral, a massive spaceship, this studio that we're sitting in right now. Lego are the building blocks in the world of toys, in the same way proteins are the building blocks in the world of biological materials. So simple proteins can be things like RNA or DNA. If you fold these onto each other, you can get collagen sheets. If you make a 3D structure out of these amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, you can build enzymes. You can build little enzyme receptors. If you made those a little bit more complicated, you could build hormones, insulin, peptide hormones. Even bigger than that, then we've got things like muscles and things like bone. Most people equate protein with just muscle building, but protein is so much more than that. It is our immune cells, our enzymes, our hormones, the very structures that enable our body to have molecules in, our organs, etc. And so when you consume protein, only around 25% actually goes to your muscles. The vast majority of the protein that you consume is concerned with building all the other materials that are so important for our physiology. And so one of the big things that I want to dispel around protein is just for bodybuilders and people obsessed with their aesthetics. You don't really need to worry about protein if that's all if you're not worried about that kind of thing. Everyone needs to be concerned around protein and ensuring they're getting enough protein for their needs. The second thing that I have come to the realization is that the current guidelines around protein requirements are based on decades old research, something called nitrogen balance studies. We now have newer models of how we determine one's protein requirements called isotopes tracing studies. And protein researchers today are of the opinion that instead of it being, and sorry to get a bit technical here, but instead of it being around 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per 24 hours, we should be aiming for a minimum of 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per 24 hours. So that's a 50% increase as a baseline. There are suggestions that you should be having more if you're more active or you're menopausal, etc. We can get into a bit later. But generally, the amount that we should be consuming should be more every single day. But there are ways in which you can consume more protein without necessarily having to go for the same products, like the same meats, the same cuts of fish, etc. There's an opportunity to actually look after our gut health and look after diversity, so you holistically look after your health rather than just your protein requirements.
But you're talking protein for men, right?
I'm talking protein for everyone. 1.2 grams is a minimum that I would say for everyone. For women, breastfeeding women, postpartum, pregnant women, it's around 1.5 to 1.6. Postmenopausal, similar amount. If you're older, so over the age of 50, it should be around 1.6 as well. But then also, if you're sarcopenic, if you've just come out of surgery, these are all things that we need to concern ourselves as well. And the good thing about this is that even though the recommendation is relatively generic, so 1.5, 1.6, it's done by body weight. So we all have individual numbers. So even if I've got a 1.6 gram measurement, your 1.6 gram measurement will be different to mine.
Right. Protein as well has the highest thermic effect of food.
Exactly.
Which a lot of people don't really understand that, burning
Yeah.
between 20 to 30% of calories
Mm-hmm.
when they digest their food. However, a lot of people undereat protein and consume more fats and carbs. Why?
Well, I think it's because, I mean, there's lots of reasons. First, people don't really
Lack of awareness as
people don't
well.
really prioritize protein. Second, a lot of the products, unfortunately, that are served to us and presented to us and are most convenient tend to be low in protein, and that includes ultra processed products as well. They tend to be low in protein because they're not satiating, and that's actually by design rather than as a sort of lack of awareness, because these food manufacturers, and we can get into this a bit later, have perfectly designed food to be like extra craveable,
Yeah.
so you don't stop. And I think also when you consume enough protein, and one of those reasons being the thermic effect of food, it is incredibly satiating as well. So just to go through the differences between fats, carbs, and
Yes, please.
protein. So when we talk about the thermic effect of food, it's in very layman's terms, the amount of energy required to break down that food and assimilate into your body. So when you break down protein, because these are macro structures, let's say you're breaking down chicken breast, for example, or edamame beans, you break it down into its constituent amino acids, of which there are around 20. There's debate as to whether there's 20 or 22, 9 of which are essential. One of the main ones being leucine, which is like one of these master sort of building blocks of amino acids that acts as a signaling molecule as well. So when you've got these different blocks, they then need to be reconstructed, just like Lego, into the constituent parts. This is quite an energy intensive process. Comparatively, carbohydrates are around 5 to 10%. So they're easier to break down into the constituent molecules, which are simple sugars. So when you eat brown rice, for example, this will all be turned into the constituent minerals and vitamins, as well as the sugars. And then fats like olive oil, for example, is anywhere between 1 and 3%. So very easy to assimilate. So this means that when you consume, let's say, 100 kilograms of chicken breast or steak, 20 to 30 of those calories is actually going to be utilized by your body to break down that protein. So it is a way of consuming food whilst not having to deal with the excess amount of calories as well.
So you're not really gaining weight, you're actually losing weight by eating enough protein.
Yeah, as long as you're still in a calorie balance, which
Yes, of course.
still holds true. The other thing is, protein by its very nature is just satiating because it stimulates the incretin hormones in our digestive system that signal to your brain that you are full as well. One of those is getting a lot of attention right now, GLP-1. So we naturally secrete GLP-1 in our body as a result of protein and fiber intake as well, which is why I'm a big fan of getting breakfast fiber and protein in, because it means that you're going to be less hungry mid-morning. You're going to be less likely to snack on all these ultra-processed foods that we're surrounded by in our day-to-day. And your body's going to be naturally satiated. So you're going to put yourself into a state where you're less likely to overconsume calories. And given that 25% of our calories today in the UK come from snacks, this would be a good thing.
Right. So I went vegan, or I tried to be vegan for 6 months. And this was about 3.5 years ago.
Okay.
And it was trending. It was the time when everyone was, turning to plant-based foods and nobody wanted to eat meat anymore. A lot of documentaries that came out and say like the unethical ways of how we've been treating the animals, and you shouldn't be eating that. And it was actually one of the things that influenced me to stop eating meat, was through a documentary that I watched. And then I went on a trip to Bali and I was like, I'm going to try it for like 3 months, and then went on for like 6 months. And at the same time, I was like, I'm going to be quitting processed foods. But I found it difficult not to consume eggs because I really enjoyed eating eggs. And what I did notice is after 3 months is the first month I was having like a lot of energy. I felt great. But over time, I started losing hair. And what I did realize over time, and by, going through a lot of friends who have been vegans for 7 years, over a decade, they actually discovered that they weren't even able to metabolize plant protein in the same way that you're able to metabolize animal protein. And they were doing that for so many years, which means that they were actually nutrient deficient. And they didn't even realize that, because most people who go and either choose veganism or an omnivore diet are not doing the tests required They don't even understand what test to take. They just follow a trend online and they're like, I want to try that because that's the
Sure.
new fad. But that's where the problem is in society today, right? We have been given so much access to social media and we are inundated with information from even people that we follow as role models who are consuming that type of diet, and then we want to look like them, be like them, because they're claiming that that's the healthy way. But then it's also like an irresponsible way of influencing because they're not providing the correct information, because we're all very bio individual, as
Yeah.
you would know this.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts as someone who is, you have a varied diet, you're eating both plant and animal protein? I thrive on plant and animal protein. What is the recommended diet for people? Should they become vegan? Should they become omnivores?
Yeah.
What is your solid advice for someone who's done research in this for so long?
Yeah, so I think there isn't a single diet that will suit everyone. And within the spectrum of diets available, there are people that will certainly thrive on a completely plant-based diet. There will be people that thrive on an omnivorous diet. There will be people that thrive on a keto and carnivore diet, quite frankly, as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is a universal diet that everyone should try. I think if we're hedging our bets, the most evidence base is around a Mediterranean diet, which is an omnivorous diet. So that's one that includes both plant and animal-based proteins. Within the sort of varied picture of how people might respond to different diets, we can explain it through a few things. So using the example that you just talked about with your friend who went vegan, the reason why they may have come to ill effect could be one of many reasons. So one, they just simply weren't consuming enough of the nutrients that they required. And the primary one that I now think of is protein. Some people will struggle to consume enough protein using the plant-based proteins that they have available to them.
It's harder.
It can be, yeah, because you need to generally consume more. And when you consume more of plant-based protein, so we'll just go through a couple just for folks at home. So tofu and tempeh are probably some of the best. Then you also have edamame and the other soy-based proteins. You also have nuts and seeds, so hemp seed and sunflower seed are some of the best. Out of the nut variety, there's peanuts, almonds, and I always forget the third one, walnuts. And then outside of that, you got some novel plant-based proteins in the form of tofu nuts, nutritional yeast. Cacao is actually really high in protein. And then you've got beans and lentils. I actually class those as lower proteins because per cooked weight, it's actually relatively low. So a typical cooked bean, like chickpea, is around 8 grams of protein per 100 grams. As someone who has to have 35 to 40 grams of protein at every meal, if I was just relying on beans and lentils, I'd have to consume a lot.
Right.
So that's probably, using Occam's razor, people just don't consume enough of the plant-based varieties. The second issue is, let's say you even consume enough. The fact that plant-based proteins also come with fiber and phytonutrients, so these plant chemicals that are really beneficial for us. For many people, it's actually a good thing. For some people, it can be a bad thing. So when you consume this much fiber, it can interfere with the absorption of protein itself. When you consume that much fiber, specifically certain types of fiber that are high in fermentable sugars, it can cause bloating, it can cause gastric discomfort, it can lead to things like intestinal hyperplasia, hyperpermeability, also known as leaky gut. It can be troublesome for people who struggle with FODMAPs as well. This again can all impact the absorption of protein as well. Some people are sensitive to things like lectins. And so if you take lectins out of the equation, you're not really left with very much in the way of plant-based proteins. In these circumstances, I do think that people would require either supplementation in the way of a plant-based protein powder that is refined, or trying to add some animal-based proteins into their diet if that's acceptable to them. So there are a few issues for people who are on a vegan or strict vegan diet. And this is something that we can't forget about. And I think this can explain the majority of the reasons why some people have issues like hair falling out and thyroid problems and skin issues and gut issues when they go vegan entirely. Many people, and if you are flexitarian or omnivore or Mediterranean diet, you're really going to be able to get the best of both worlds. And the way I sort of give people a formula for how they can up their protein in a healthy way is by having a core protein source. So that might look like chicken or fish or lean beef, for example. It could be tempeh, it could be tofu. And then you have your core protein source, you supplement that with a plant-based partner. So that could be lentils, legumes, bit of nuts, whatever it might be, nut butter in the form of a stew or casserole. And then you have a topper as well. And that topper could be nutritional yeast blended with cashew and a bit of oregano as like a way to sort of add some texture to your meal, but then also just slightly nudge up your protein content by 4 or 5 grams. Every gram counts in this case as well. So that way you're not necessarily relying on just getting more and more meat, which lacks fiber and lacks all the benefits of plants. You're still bumping up your protein without having to rely on a single source, and you're adding diversity, complexity that your gut will thank you for as well. So I think, to answer your question more formally, an omnivorous diet is going to be best for most people. If people have concerns, and I think we have to accept the legitimate concerns of the way we raise animals at the moment for feeding, in a lot of cases, it can be not only environmentally destructive, but also just unethical. When people transition to vegan diets for those reasons, you have to be really cognizant about, how you get your plant-based protein content in as well. There are a few things. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox in a minute, but there are a few things that I think you can do in that plant-based arena that will maximize the bang for your buck. Right? Soaking and sprouting things like lentils and legumes actually makes the proteins a lot more bioavailable, which is why I'm such a big fan of tempeh, because tempeh is... I love
tempeh.
Yeah, it's great. It's soybeans that have been fermented, so the amino acids are a lot more bioavailable. You get the parabiotic effect because you've got some of those bacterial cell walls that are dead, and that actually supports your gut microbes as well, so it has a prebiotic effect. And it can be delicious as well. And tempeh is not even a single product. It's a process. It's tempeh fermentation. So you can actually tempeh a number of different items. So there's soaking, there's sprouting, there's also fermenting as well. That again adds it. And then protein layering. So you're getting the best of both worlds by combining grains, nuts, legumes, etc. That way you're covering all the bases of the differences in amino acids.
I also am curious to know what your thoughts are, because research says that actually only less than 10% of people can metabolize plant protein. Let's take a short pause and reflect on what's truly impacting your health. You can eat clean, meditate, take your supplements, but if your space is toxic, your body stays in survival mode. At AWA, they design homes that do the actual opposite of that. They amplify your energy. Crystal charged, light balanced, air purified, and aligned with the rhythms of nature. Because true wellness doesn't stop in your skin. It surrounds you. AWA. Homes that heal, homes that know you. Now back to the conversation, because the future of wellness starts at home. Is this true?
So less than 10% can metabolize plant protein.
And the rest actually can't. So which means that we're more likely to or necessarily have to intake protein through animal sources than it is from just plants alone.
I'd be interested in how they determined that it was 10%, because when you consume any food, you will be able to break it down into its constituent parts, whether we're looking at a carbohydrate, a fat, or a protein. As long as everything is in order. So as long as you're producing enough stomach acid, as long as you don't have dysbiosis or an unfavorable microbial pattern in your digestive tract.
But that's the problem, right? There are all these other things to consider.
There are,
right?
yeah.
There's also, it isn't even just a straightforward answer.
Yeah.
You just mentioned so many things that people actually need to consider, aside from just the fact that that's the number.
Yeah.
There's these issues which are actually so prevalent, and people don't even realize that it's a problem. And that's the reason why they can't metabolize certain things, eat a certain way, why they can't lose weight, they're always bloated, they have constipation, all of these issues is something that people really need to understand and have a lot more awareness in that people don't.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the things can be put down to the amount of processed foods that we have in our diet in the first place. So, in combination of removing the bad stuff, putting our body in the right state, we should be more than capable of being able to break down plant-based proteins as well as animal-based proteins into its constituent amino acids where it can be reassimilated in the body. Where I think there is a bit of confusion around the quality of animal versus plant-based proteins, I think the current metric system by which we determine quality is in some way flawed. So the key ones that we tend to see come up in nutrition studies are PDCAAS and DIAS. These are protein digestibility scores and protein absorption scores. So this determines how readily absorbable the amino acids from, let's say, whey protein, milk protein, chicken protein are compared to bean protein, soy protein, protein from potatoes, etc. When you look at those studies, the quality metrics are always highest for animal-based proteins. They tend to be more digestible. They tend to be more easier to absorb. And the reasons why are because they don't contain fiber. They don't contain any other constituents like anti-nutrients that can interfere with that absorption. When you look at, so that's in isolation. And if we were to just focus on quality metrics, all roads lead to whey protein. So whey protein is refined waste products of the cheese making process. So the amino acids are really absorbable. So if you are only concerned with ensuring that you have enough of these amino acids, you could just take whey protein and you'll be covering your bases. That's not the best way of eating, in my opinion. When you look at studies where they compare a mixed plate of different proteins and different ingredients, fiber, veggies, etc., as long as the protein is equivalent, the impact on things like muscle protein synthesis and how you can best absorb those proteins is very, very similar. I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. One is definitely more convenient than the other, and that would be the case for animal-based proteins. But I wouldn't state that if you're a vegetarian or vegan, you can't do it. You absolutely can, but you definitely need to be a lot more considerate, and we need to get really real about that.
Dr. Stacy Sims, I mentioned to you earlier, like she went viral and she's someone really focused on women's health, only because the understanding currently is that the research has been focused on data based on men.
Yeah.
And everything around men's health has also been programmed to how women should eat, live, think.
Yeah.
All of that stuff. Right? And it blew my mind and how she spoke about so many important topics that I myself had no idea about, because, if you have research papers that have been only focused on men's health and everything else has been hidden because they don't want to focus on women's health because women have hormones and periods and everything's fluctuating all the time, the men's health is more stable. Of course, you'd rather just go and do what's easier for people to understand, right? But isn't necessarily what's good for women.
Sure.
So what is your understanding on that? Can we elaborate on women specifically in their 30s who are in perimenopause? What is the recommended daily allowance of protein intake for women? How do they know that they have reached perimenopause? And then for women like myself in my 40s, what's the recommended protein intake? I'm not in menopause yet, but it's coming.
Yeah.
I'm trying to delay it as long as possible.
Sure.
But, what can I do to kind of like make sure that I'm consuming enough protein in my 40s?
Yeah. So a few questions there. So
Yeah.
I'll go through it one by one.
Okay.
So I agree with you. I think the research body that we have is largely based on men. And in fact, the nitrogen balance studies that I was referring to earlier that I think were conducted in the 80s were done on young, healthy males. Not only is that not attributable to many men, but certainly not for the opposite sex as well. And when they did these nitrogen balance studies, they're very well controlled. They're in a metabolic ward chamber. Like there are so many things that they've done that are great, but it's just the inputs, i.e. the cohorts, the participants that they chose, were just not reflective of everyone in the population. So the degree to how transferable that information is to the general population is flawed. And now that we have better methods as well, I think we can safely say that we can do better with our recommendations. So for women in their 30s, I think it really depends on their state of whether they're pregnant, breastfeeding, their exercise status, and whether they are sedentary as well. So yeah, exercise status. The general rule would be 1.2 grams. That
1.2 grams.
Yeah, so that
per body weight.
Per kilogram of ideal body weight per 24 hours. I want to emphasize ideal body weight because if you are 100 kilograms, but you are not at your ideal body weight, and your ideal body weight is, let's say, closer to 70 kilograms or 65 kilograms, you want to use that kilogram 2 times against the 1.2 metric.
Good explanation.
And then you can divide that by the number of meals that you choose to consume. So I personally have 3 meals. Some people might enjoy the intermittent fasting or the time restricted feeding practice of just having 2 meals. Some people have 1 meal a day. I don't mind that as long as you get your protein and fiber requirements.
How are you going to get your protein and fiber requirements?
It's very
for 1
hard.
Meal a day?
It's very hard. I think it's a practice that a lot of people who are actively trying to lose weight and require strict guidelines around themselves and their self-control are benefiting from. For many people, I think it's too restrictive, and you fall into the trap of not consuming enough fuel for your needs, which could lead to fatigue over time and very quickly falling off the wagon and going back to your old eating habits.
But then people compensate with like protein shakes.
Exactly.
Protein powders
too,
right?
Yeah.
So even if you're not eating a main meal, you're trying to get the protein intake from these protein powders.
Exactly.
And we can talk a little bit about, your take on the protein powders after.
Totally, yeah. So those would be the general metrics that I would look at. 1.6 would be if you are active. So someone who is resistance training a couple of times a week, someone who is doing aerobic training, steady state cardio. These are all things I would say you want to be looking at 1.6. 1.7 is for breastfeeding and pregnant ladies.
Okay, amazing.
That's really hard. My wife is currently breastfeeding at the moment. We have a 4-month-old, which is why I'm a little bit slow today. Getting 1.7 to 1.8 grams in her is very hard because we have a kid, and that determines how much we can actually cook.
That's right.
But just physically getting that much protein in is quite hard. And this is where I think protein powders and may have a role, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Postmenopause, I think the baseline should be 1.6. There was this study actually that was all done on women called the Liftmore study in Australia. And what they were trying to ascertain is whether resistance training in combination with a high protein diet actually could improve metrics of bone health and bone quality. So we do DEXA scans to determine bone mineralization postmenopausally, one of the big issues, along with cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's and everything that goes with estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone decline, unfortunately, is lack of bone as well. So your bones tend to become less dense, and we currently have drugs to try and slow that down, like alendronate, for example, and there's some other novel therapeutics. And we used to say, don't exercise because that may put you at high risk of fracture. So don't do heavy weights. We now know this is completely the wrong advice. And in this study, what they did is I believe it was 2 or 3 rounds of personal trainer supervised resistance training in combination with a high protein diet of around 1.6 grams every day for 12 weeks. And not only did they show that they could reduce the steepness of the decline in their bone mineral density, but in some cases it was flat and even improved, which as a medical doctor is astounding because that isn't meant to happen. You're not meant to increase your bone mineral density. It's always going to decline, particularly as we age in general.
Right.
So this was like a real eye-opener for me, and this is why I think any woman around the menopause or postmenopausally, even those in their 60s, 70s plus, can still build muscle and they can still put on bone mineral, improve the bone mineralization as well with a high protein diet and resistance training. The benefits of 1.6 grams upwards, I think, are unclear, which is why I wouldn't suggest going up. And I think it comes with potential trade-offs. Those trade-offs are, if you try and go, let's say, to 2 grams, you potentially put yourself at risk of over-consuming your protein products that can increase your calories surplus to your requirements. And anything that increases your calories surplus to your requirements can lead to weight gain. It can lead to putting on fat where you don't want to put fat, and certainly into your liver as well. These are all things that unfortunately can occur at an accelerated rate post-menopause, which is why I think unless you're really, really strict, 1.6 grams is a good baseline. And anything above, I think the benefits are marginal at best.
So are you consuming way more than 1.6 if you're someone that really trains hard at the gym 5 days a week? If you do weight training.
If you do weight training and you want to consume more than 1.6 to have some marginal gains, go for it. But just always be aware that
it's below 2.
Yeah.
It has to be below 2.
It doesn't have to be below 2. You can do 2.5, you can do 3 even. And that is like, as long as your kidneys are healthy, again, another myth that needs busting.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that.
You won't damage your kidneys by having excess protein in your body.
If there's a lot of talk about your kidneys going to get damaged if you eat too much protein, but people don't realize it doesn't work like that on healthy individuals.
There's no research.
More on unhealthier individuals that has already a kidney issue, perhaps.
There's no evidence to suggest that if you consume excess protein to your requirements, you will damage healthy kidneys. You will simply excrete any extra protein in the form of urea, and it will not bash on your kidneys or cause any ill effects or whatever. If you overconsume calories as part of that excess protein that you're consuming, that's when you put yourself at potential risk of metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, that can have an effect on your kidneys. So this is where we have to be aware of the potential trade-offs of over-consuming protein in general, particularly from animal-based products, particularly from saturated fat-rich animal-based products as well, because this can interfere with insulin signaling.
So give an example of some saturated fats.
So saturated fats come in lots of different forms. So you've got saturated fats in dairy products, you've got saturated fats in
butter,
chocolate, you've got butter, you've got eggs, and you've also got it in like meat products like poultry and
people eat eggs every single day. You have bodybuilders that go like 11 eggs a day.
Yeah, you do.
Right? They go extreme in that. Is that what you mean?
They can, but I wouldn't recommend doing that because you want to get a blend of different.
So what's the recommended amount of eggs per day?
So
for a man and a woman?
So the safe amount of eggs that I think is generally acceptable for most people is about an egg a day. So that's 7 eggs a week. If you want to have more, I don't think there's a problem with that, but we're going to think holistically about our diet. So when you're consuming eggs, it's not just going to be eggs on its own. It's going to be with edamame beans, fiber, all these other nutrients, and vary up your protein sources because what eggs lack, lean red meat might have, tofu and tempeh might have as well. So you want to get a real big selection of those. And so just going back to saturated fats, because you asked me about that. So when you can overconsume saturated fats from, let's say, fatty steaks, and you're having fatty steaks every single day, when you're having excess amounts of saturated fats, it can build up in things like your liver, that can interfere with insulin signaling, that can interfere with or can lead to a high risk of things like type 2 diabetes as well. So I'm not saying you need to remove all saturated fats from your diet and never touch a steak again. I'm saying ensure that you're not over-consuming fats as part of your calorie collection. So the different types of sources of food that you can contribute.
So there are people that eat steak every single day and enjoy it and feel that's the right way to eat. Do you recommend that?
No, I don't recommend that.
You don't recommend steak every single day?
No, I wouldn't recommend steak every day. The reason why I think is because most people would benefit from having more fiber in their diet.
Right.
And when you consume steak every day or like excess amounts of red meat every day, you're pushing out the opportunity to consume other foods. If you still consume the other foods, then you could be putting yourself at a calorie surplus. And we know that calorie surplus all roads leads to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and potential dementia as well.
So I'm someone who is like, I have a sleep chronotype that's a bear. So I like to go to bed really early. So about 8, 9 p.m. I'm
Yeah,
in
me
bed
too.
and I wake up at 5 a.m. And I like
Yeah.
to start my day like that.
Hmm.
Also, when I wake up, it's just a normal routine for me to go for a workout because I don't find the energy to do that in the evenings. I don't have the chronobiology to be able to get myself to that state where I can,
Yeah.
feel like energized in the evening to work out.
Yeah.
And I like to work out fasted. However, there's a lot of debate between, women should go fasted training and it should work better for men and not for women. So please tell me,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
what your thoughts are on that.
I think so I'm the same. So I will go to sleep early, wake up early and train fasted. It works for me, and intuitively I don't feel fatigue afterwards. I feel that I have the opportunity to refuel after a workout
I'm not
very
even hungry
easily.
after, to
It
be honest.
Yeah,
Like,
I
it takes
mean,
me a while
yeah,
before
yeah,
I
yeah.
feel like I want to eat something.
Yeah, well, exercise will reduce your appetite
Right,
afterwards.
totally.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it really comes down to the individual. And I would say to anyone listening to this, you have to start being your own expert. You have to start being your own nutritionist, and you have to start looking inside to determine whether something is right for you. Because if we blindly follow experts, then
Exactly.
we'll end up eating a pure vegan diet, a pure carnivore
Exactly.
diet, or fasting for 3 days and never fasting, eating once a day, eating 4 times a day. So we really have to figure out a pattern that works for us. It sounds like you've done that yourself. You know that if you train fasted, you're not that hungry, you can still push through a workout
Yeah,
and
I
you can
feel
refuel
great throughout the
afterwards.
day. I don't have issues
Exactly.
with that
Yeah, totally. Whereas my wife is someone that will need to have something like,
to consume.
walnuts or, a piece of bread an hour before she goes to work out because
Yeah,
otherwise she feels a bit faint.
right.
So everyone is really different in their own starting point. And so I think you have to determine what's great for you. What I would say is that it's perfectly safe to train fasted, and certainly for people who have excess body weight, what it
Right.
does is when you're in that fasted state, you tip into fat burning mode, for want of a better term. You start dipping into your adipose tissues as a store of energy. Your glucose level will always be flat because your liver is able to produce glucose molecules. But what it will start doing is tapping up your fat cells and turning those into stores, accessible fatty acids that your muscles can burn. And so when you train in that and you start doing zone 2 training or endurance training or weightlifting, you're utilizing that store. And if you refuel, and as long as you're not over consuming calories, you will start losing weight. So I think for people who are looking to lose weight, it is something that it could be a beneficial tool.
And for listeners that are listening to this and really struggle with protein intake, whether they're vegans, omnivores, what are your top hacks
So
just to start eating better protein and the right amounts of protein every day?
totally. So I would say definitely try and get breakfast protein. It gives you an opportunity to have another dose of
Can
protein
that be
in
a
the.
protein shake?
So I would suggest getting a high protein and high fiber breakfast that is made out of real food.
Right,
And
whole foods.
whole foods. The reason why is because that's what we know will trigger those satiety hormones,
Right.
those I'm not hungry anymore hormones. And it's filling as well. And I don't think we should start relying on protein shakes or protein powders, particularly at the start of the day.
Right.
A lot of these powders unfortunately have additives, emulsifiers, sweeteners. I think as a daily staple, these aren't things that we should be relying on. When you find yourself in a pinch, and I'm someone who has protein powders myself, I go for unflavored, unprocessed, or minimally processed, I should say, one ingredient powders. That could be a whey protein, it could be, and I usually go for an organic whey protein, it could be a blend of plant
Do you have a
proteins.
brand that you suggest?
So I don't have a brand. There are multiple ones out there. I can't
Okay.
actually remember the brand that I use. There's one called
So
Form
so
that I
yours is
use,
a
but
is an animal-based protein,
I use
right?
both. So
Okay.
I mix it up. So
Okay.
sometimes I have whey. Sometimes I have a plant-based one that's a
Right.
mixture of corn, pea, and rice, again from organic sources,
Right.
and it's independently lab tested to be low in contaminants and heavy metals. Unfortunately, a lot of protein powders do have this
Right.
issue.
That's why I asked the kind of brand, because it's all like, what do you trust these days?
So a good brand will have on their website somewhere where they've done an independent lab test. The best brands will have that.
Independent lab
And
test.
every brand, every product will have some level of cadmium or maybe not lead, but there are always some levels of contaminants in our food. It's just the very nature of the environment.
Yeah.
Organic food will still have some pesticides as residue, compared to conventional, but still some. The best brands are transparent about this. I don't know if you know Brian Johnson.
Of course.
So Brian Johnson's products all have the contaminant values independently tested. His chocolate has got cadmium in. His chocolate has got lead in. His chocolate's got mercury in.
Yeah.
But in just the lower amounts that you'll find in a typical manufacturer.
Got it.
His community understand that. A lot of people don't understand that. And so they'll see those and we're like, oh my God, I'm not going to go for that one. But that's because they're telling you and they're being transparent about it. The other brands won't.
Right.
So the plant-based protein powders that I use will have those third-party tested lab values on. And I trust those implicitly because they're honest about it. And we should all be honest. So going back to my point, at breakfast time, I actually have like an overnight oats that I use all the time, but it's not a typical overnight oats. It actually doesn't have that many oats in. So it's 2 tablespoons of oats, 2 tablespoons of milled flax, a tablespoon of chia, and a tablespoon of shelled hemp seeds, milk of choice, and then I add cacao, I add pumpkin seeds, and I'll add some other elements to it as well. I think like a sweetener, like some raw honey. And that is actually really high in protein in those amounts. It's around 30 to 35 grams. If you want to boost it anymore,
sounds delicious.
you could add a protein powder to that as well.
I'm going to add that to my diet.
You can add that, yeah. Berries, banana, whatever fruits you want as well. Grated apple. It's beautiful and it's super convenient as well. So I'd rather have that than a protein shake.
Yeah.
If I am going to make a protein shake, it will be one of those very unflavored, minimally processed powders with a frozen banana, some berries, again, cacao, nut butter, peanut butter, all blended together. And I want to flavor it myself. I don't want to rely on a company to flavor it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And how about for lunch and dinner?
Yeah, so
what are the
lunch
like
is
the
usually
quick hacks for people who really, there's a lot of people that don't even eat a lot.
Yeah.
And they kind of just have to force themselves to eat more because they have to get the protein intake.
Yeah. So I have diversity bowls quite a bit. There's a whole bunch in the book, Healthy High Protein, where there's like, I just have rocket, sauerkraut, some black beans, sweet corn, and like some leftover salmon, or I've got a marinated salmon recipe, but there's also like a crispy tofu. And that is like a great collection of like high fiber ingredients, fermented ingredients, and protein. And then for dinner, I'm always a big fan of one pan meals. So last night I actually made like this cod cheek dish. I knew cod cheeks. They're delicious and they're a lot cheaper than cod fillet. Yeah, they're really cheap and they're so good. Ask your fishmonger for it. And actually, any like cheek from fish or animal-based products are really good and very nutritious, and we tend not to eat them as well. In the same way, we don't eat organ meats anymore and stuff. And they're very, very nutrient dense as well. So I have that, and then I made that with like tomatoes, garlic, some greens, a bunch of spices like paprika and cumin, and then just poached the cod in that, and then finished it off with some dill. And it was delicious. We had that with like a side salad and like some new potatoes that I just simply roasted. So yeah, I mean, like I always do like one pan or one tray meals during the week.
That's my favorite thing.
Yeah.
Something super easy, simple that anybody can do because most people are busy.
Yeah.
So I own a meal plan company in Dubai, and we have this anti-inflammatory, gut-friendly meals that we deliver to people daily. So it's fresh and it's on the go, so people don't have to go and get Deliveroo or all these unhealthy options. Because when you're in meetings all day, you don't want to think about having to go and get something healthy, right? You just want something quick and easy.
Totally, yeah.
So because Dubai or just larger cities have this very much a takeout culture
Yeah.
because they have no time to cook. It makes it easier for us to be able to produce meals for people
Yeah.
that they don't have to think about what's the next meal.
Yeah.
Right? So I get it from that aspect. And I'm also quite busy myself, but I'm like you, I try my best to cook at home every day
Yeah.
because there's nothing like a home cooked meal where we understand where the
Yeah.
ingredients are coming from. Also, the use of different type of oils because
Yeah.
that really causes inflammation. And the more that we're using these seed oils, negatively impact inflammation in our gut health, right? Another thing I want to ask you is your book that has now come out. And where can people get it? How many recipes are in there? What can people expect when they receive this book?
Yeah, so there's over 100 recipes. Everything is high protein, but the front section is organized in 3 areas. So there's protein, why it's important, why it's more than just muscles, why it has an impact on focus, energy, strength, why it's important for women, why it's important for menopause. And then the second and third sections are in gut health and inflammation, respectively.
My favorite part.
Yeah, because like a meal can't just be high protein for high protein, for the sake of high protein.
Yes, of course.
It has to be inclusive of also being good for your gut and also being good for inflammation as well. And so I want people to think holistically about their plates in that way. And if you can answer these 3 questions, is there enough protein for my needs on this plate? Are they gut-friendly ingredients? And is this going to be anti-inflammatory? Then you're looking at a really healthy meal. And so the recipes complement that. Every recipe has got the protein, fiber, and plant diversity number on it, as well as ways in which to boost your protein if your protein requirements are different. So your protein requirements are going to be different to my protein requirements. And so on every recipe, I've like, okay, you just need to increase the tahini, walnuts, and salmon in this to boost up your protein. Or this recipe, you can have this amount of the recipe and then the other bit is like for you because that's got more protein. We need to be a little bit more intuitive about these amounts, particularly as people who are interested in their health and well-being. And then I also have a section in the book, which is like a double page spread of like how much protein there is per 100 grams of all these different novel ingredients, because we should all be very good guesstimators of how much protein there is on our plate without having to weigh food or like measure it or use an app. Or
I think people do it initially and then they kind of get the hang of it.
Yes, yeah. And I want people to do that. So, like if you put a small handful of pumpkin seeds onto your salad, that's about 6 grams of protein. Great. You've just increased it by like 20%. The same thing with hemp seeds, the same thing with tahini, the same thing with a little bit of cooked chicken, like to a plant-based meal. This can all be a way in which to subtly boost the content of the protein content of your
I can't wait to buy the book and try the recipes. It's definitely going to be a staple in my home, that's for sure.
We'll send you a copy, don't worry.
Please, thank you. Because like I love cooking anyway, and I love to be able to, diversify my recipes myself
for sure,
and
for
something
sure.
different. And I'm sure all of the listeners will buy this book too because it sounds incredible.
Amazing.
Just by you talking about it, sounds incredible.
Amazing.
Thank you so much for being an advocate for creating great impact on gut health and changing people's lives, because we definitely need more people like you in the world. The last question that I ask everyone on my podcast is, what does Be That Life mean to you?
Oh, Be That Life. I think, for me, a lot has changed over the last few months. And I think showing up for not just myself, but my son, Raphael, and ensuring that I'm a beacon and a touch point for him, but also a model of like how to act, how to navigate this complicated world, and how to just be true to yourself. This is what I live for as well now.
An incredible man with a great mission.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Rupy.
Thank you so much.